Hi, I'm Dustin Saraga, an immigration lawyer with Scott Legal PC in New York. In this video, I'll be discussing a few frequently asked questions about the TN visa, which is one of our firm's most popular visa options. Among other things, we'll take a look at the process of moving from one TN employer to another, and of adding a concurrent TN employer. First, a bit of background on the TN visa. The TN visa was originally created through NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as a way for nationals of Canada and Mexico to more easily enter the U.S. to work for a U.S. employer. The application process is relatively simple and fast, especially for nationals of Canada who can apply for a TN visa at the border or apply for TN status at the border. With a TN visa, you can stay in the U.S. for up to 3 years at a time, and there's no limit to the number of times you can renew a TN visa. One of the conveniences of a TN visa is that it allows flexibility in the employment arrangement. You can, for example, change from one TN employer to another, and you can also work for more than one employer on a TN visa, which is called concurrent employment. While the requirements for a TN visa are fairly straightforward, there are some aspects of the process that are unique to concurrent employment. Remember that because a TN visa or TN status is granted for the TN worker to work for a specific employer, it's important to first receive authorization from the U.S. government for each TN employer before starting to work for them. For any TN visa, the applicant must demonstrate to the government that they have an offer of employment from a U.S. employer, that they'll practice one of the professions that's specifically listed in the TN regulations, and that they have the required educational or professional background for that specific profession as described in the TN regulations. We'll include a link to the TN regulations in the show notes below. When an applicant is requesting permission to work for 2 TN employers, the government will require that the applicant satisfy these requirements for each employer. As a result, applying for concurrent employment generally has a higher chance of denial than applying for a single TN employer. Nonetheless, requests for concurrent TN employment are frequently granted, particularly if certain aspects of the application are kept in mind. In any TN application, it's important that the applicant make clear how they qualify for the visa under the TN regulations. This is especially important for concurrent employment. The applicant should, for each employer, make clear what profession they'll be practicing, how they qualify for that profession, and why the employer requires their services. This should all be detailed in the letter from the employer that the applicant submits with their application, and it should also be demonstrated in the supporting documents provided with the application, such as diplomas, transcripts, and experience letters from past employers if required for that profession. Also, the concurrent employment should make sense logistically. Concurrent employment opportunities that require the applicant to work 2 60-hour-per-week jobs probably won't be believable to a government officer. The application should show that the employers and the applicant have put thought into how the employee will perform the required work for each employer. Like adding a concurrent employer, it's also not uncommon for those who are in the U.S. to choose to simply change from one TN employer to another. This, like adding a concurrent employer, is also permitted as long as the TN worker and employer satisfy the TN regulations. As with adding a concurrent employer, the TN visa holder cannot begin working for the new TN employer until the U.S. government approves the change of TN employer. So let's take a look at the process to either add a concurrent TN employer or to change TN employers. There are several options to apply for this authorization, depending on whether the TN worker is a national of Canada or Mexico. The TN visa holder who receives an offer of employment from a new TN employer and either wants to change to this new employer or add the new employer as a concurrent employer has the same options to request authorization from the U.S. government as they had to apply for the initial TN visa or TN status. They can apply through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, by filing a Form I-129. They can apply at a consulate through the U.S. Department of State by filing a Form DS-160, or if they are a Canadian national, they can apply at a border through U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. In addition, in certain circumstances, Mexican nationals may be able to apply to change TN employers or to apply for concurrent employment at the border without going to the consulate. First, let's talk about applying for new or concurrent TN employment at the border, an option that's available to Canadians whether or not they already have a valid TN visa, and to Mexican nationals who do already have a valid TN visa. To apply at the border, the applicant would present the required application materials for the new TN employment opportunity, including a letter from the new employer detailing their need for the TN employee, the applicant's background and qualifications, the time frame of the employment opportunity, and the salary that'll be paid, among other things. For concurrent employment, the applicant would notify the government of their intention to work for more than one TN employer and would provide application materials for both employers. Upon approval, the applicant would be able to begin working for the new TN employer or for both employers concurrently. The benefit of applying for authorization at the border is that the applicant will receive an immediate decision. Upon being granted entry, they can immediately begin working for the new TN employer or both employers if they're applying for concurrent employment. Among the disadvantages of applying at the border is that, depending on the profession, certain ports of entry can be more challenging. For example, management consultants face higher scrutiny in general and at certain ports of entry in particular. Fortunately, as mentioned earlier, Mexican nationals who have a valid TN visa also have the option to change TN employers or add a concurrent employer at a port of entry. At the border, they would present their existing valid TN visa along with a letter from the new TN employer or from both employers if they're applying for concurrent employment. It's also recommended that they bring all supporting documentation showing that they qualify for the TN visa under the new employer or both employers for concurrent employment. Mexican and Canadian nationals can, in the alternative, apply for authorization to work for a new TN employer or a concurrent employer through a consulate. The process would be very similar to the process required for an initial TN visa application. To apply for new or concurrent TN employment at a consulate, the applicant would file a Form DS-160 online and would specify that they're applying for a TN visa in order to work for two TN employers or for just the new TN employer if they're looking to change employers. The applicant will want to bring to their interview the necessary supporting documentation that supports employment for the new employer or for both employers if they're seeking concurrent employment. Keep in mind that Mexican nationals who do not already have a valid TN visa must apply at a consulate and cannot apply at a port of entry. Finally, let's talk about applying from within the United States through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. Both Canadian and Mexican nationals can apply for authorization to change TN employers or to add a concurrent employer through USCIS. To do so, the applicant must be physically present in the United States. This can be an attractive option if the applicant doesn't want to leave the United States, since the process can be completed without leaving. To do so, the new TN employer must file a Form I-129, a petition for a non-immigrant worker. On this form, they would specify that the TN worker is seeking TN status in order to work for a new employer, or in the case of concurrent employment, to work for two employers. They would include all required supporting documentation for the new employer or both employers if they're seeking concurrent employment. Although USCIS may require several months to adjudicate the Form I-129, applicants have the option to request premium processing, which would provide a decision within 15 calendar days for an additional fee of $2,500. Keep in mind that USCIS can only grant TN status for the duration of the applicant's time in the United States. Once they depart, they should plan to submit their TN materials either to a port of entry or at a consulate. Fortunately, Mexican nationals who have a valid TN visa and receive an approved I-129 for the new or concurrent TN employer while they're in the United States can avoid going to the consulate for a new visa by simply bringing the I-129 approval notice and visa to a port of entry. A common question we receive is how the application with USCIS could impact the TN visa holder's current TN employment. In other words, if USCIS denies the application to add a newer concurrent employer, will the existing TN status be affected? The answer is no. The applicant's underlying TN status should not be affected if the I-129 is denied. Unlike an application that's submitted at the border, which is submitted by the TN worker, the Form I-129 is filed by the employer. Note that the employer's responsibilities are minimal, and there's no required sponsorship by the employer, in spite of the fact that the employer must sign and submit the Form I-129. As a result, the TN worker can continue to work for their original TN employer, even if the Form I-129 requesting a change of employment to the new TN employer or concurrent employment is ultimately denied. We hope this video was helpful, and if it was, please go ahead and click the like and subscribe buttons below to stay updated on future videos about visa options and travel to the US. Thank you for watching.